Hello everybody, welcome to Tuesday's Lean In. I hope you had a great Easter. My name is Michael Linky. I'm the General Manager here at the Australian Institute of Architects, reporting live from my dinner table, and I'm really excited to have Susie Hopkins with us today, who's the founder of Lilo Wellness. This is a really popular session. We promoted this morning, and so far we've had about 250 people register for it, so it has become very popular in a very short amount of time, and probably for good reason. So as we know, COVID-19 means that the streets are empty, and it means that we are having to self-isolate, and we are stuck inside, confined to our dinner tables and our kitchens and our quickly homemade offices and things like that. So that has added to daily stress and anxiety, especially when we've been made to self-isolate with our family members who we've never spent so much time with. And so it feels sometimes like there's nothing that we can really do about the pandemic that we're facing in time. And we are relieved that there are steps that we can take to relieve some of the pressure and anxiety and stress that we are feeling from being cooped up and also not knowing what the future holds. So we're really excited to have Susie Hopkins with us from Lilo Wellness. She has spent around 30 years working as a registered nurse, and then left that career and then became a health coach in the corporate sector. And so we're really fortunate to have her with us today. She's a qualified mindfulness and yoga instructor, and she's very passionate, is Susie, about translating very complex research into very practical, impactful strategies for stress management. So today's 30 minutes will be led by Susie on how to cope with stress and anxiety in this unprecedented period in which we're existing. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Susie Hopkins.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for the intro and for welcoming me today. I just wanted to mention that I have worked quite a lot in the architecture industry, helping people manage stress. So through that experience and a number of personal connections, I have some idea of the pressures that you face. And I know that it's a very tumultuous time as well, on top of the ordinarily stressful industry that it can be. So before I get into the content today, I did want to just mention that I'm not going to sit here and tell you what you should do. I just would like to provide some information about what the research says can help in managing stress. We need to be, I think, pretty careful of shoulds at this time. That's the only should we should be focusing on, is just as much understanding for ourselves and cutting ourselves slack, and also cutting slack for those around us as well. So the emphasis today of what we're talking about is at the individual level, but I thought it was worth mentioning that, of course, situational factors really impact stress, and not just in regards to work, as we are very well experiencing, but the times we live in and the amount of information that we're exposed to, and the use of technology also really contribute. So while today is about the individual, there is plenty that can be done at an organisational level as well, and we will touch on that. But most of today will be about what we can do as individuals. Okay, next slide, please.
I'm just going to jump back in here, Susie, before you start. For those joining us on video calls, would it be fantastic? We're having some struggles with bandwidth and volume. If you can kindly mute your video, and if possible, not broadcast yourself today. If that's okay.
Followed by hash.
A good example there, just to mute oneself on your video, if that's okay for us. Sorry, Susie, back to you.
Sure, now. There are more than 130 participants in the meeting. This meeting is being recorded.
Someone needs to press mute, I think. All right, Kat, next slide, thank you. All right, so in a nutshell, what we're going to talk about today is the physiology of the stress response, what's happening in the body. And that will lead into what we can do about it, and not just what we can do about it, but how that works on a physiological level. So we're really going to look at what the evidence says helps manage stress. And within that, there's a lot of common sense. And part of the process is really just about getting very intentional. But one area that is perhaps a little baffling for some people is mindfulness, because there's a lot of misinformation around. So we thought that this was a great opportunity to discuss and have a look at the science behind why mindfulness is seen to be so incredibly beneficial for stress. And we'll do a brief practice as well. And you will have an opportunity to really reflect on, once we've gone over all that information, what you can do to help yourself manage stress. And, you know, given the current circumstances, of course, it's more important than ever. All right, next slide, please, Kat. So one of the most important principles, I think, is to just point out that stress is normal. We kind of demonize stress. We feel like if we can't manage stress, then, you know, that's somehow a reflection on us. But it is a physiological process, and it is an adaptive process. But unfortunately, it is somewhat, in some ways, perhaps outdated. So basically, the stress response starts in the brain with the amygdala becoming active. It's almost instantaneous when we see a threat, and it really primes us to either fight or flee. Or freeze, but primarily to either fight or flee. So when the amygdala fires, it leads to a series of neurotransmitters and hormones being released, and then a number of physiological processes start as a result of that. One of the hormones that is released sometimes is called a stress hormone, or the stress hormone is cortisol. And when that is released, if it's in the body over long periods of time, there is someone at my door. Talk about managing stress. Just one moment. I'm busy. I'm sorry, I'm busy.
Just in the random time that Susie's had to answer that door, we have got the chat box open as well. So if you do have any questions, if there are any sort of questions from yourself or from your family members that you want to ask Susie, don't forget to just type them in there, and then I'll moderate those at the end of the session just to make sure that we have those questions answered for you. So yeah, don't forget also to mute your speaker sessions as well if you are joining us. And Susie is back. Sorry, I was just filling the time, just talking about the chat function. So what I was saying, Susie, is all of our members, if they have any questions, I'll moderate them at the end and then go back from there.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. That was fairly hilarious because the delivery person was very unimpressed with me. So it could have been quite stressful. I'm choosing to have a laugh, but anyway, these things happen. And it's not that unlikely that my 5-year-old will come and visit us at some point too. So we'll see how we go. All right. So with these physiological changes in the body, there's a couple of them that probably won't surprise you. Our breathing becomes quicker and more shallow, and also our blood vessels constrict as our blood pressure goes up. So all these things happen to give us energy, and all of the circulation from the center, like our core and our vital organs, goes out into our skeletal muscles. And we experience that as a big rush of stress. But the problem can be that many of us are experiencing some stress most of the time. And what happens in that case is that the amygdala in the brain is somewhat active most of the time. And this can be very problematic. So, Kat, I'll get you to go to the next slide. So too much stress, too much of the time, can cause really serious health problems if left unchecked. So the list of health problems is as long as my arm, and it can really exacerbate any health problem that you're already dealing with and lead to a number. But in terms of work and performance, it also leads to poor mental functioning and can lead to depression. So along with this presentation, we will provide some resources, and there is a really interesting article about the link between stress and depression that you might find really useful. But one thing that I want to mention about stress as well is that, you know, in your industry where deadlines and so many stakeholders and many factors make it really very stressful at times. Some of the people that I've worked with in the architecture industry talk about now that they're getting very intentional about managing stress, that they see these times as a bit like a marathon, and they prepare for it and then also allow time to recover afterwards. So preparing for these times by making sure they're getting enough sleep and exercising and doing all these things that we're going to be talking about in a moment. So that's another way to look at how you can sort of embed a different way of doing things, really prioritising looking after your stress levels. All right, Kat, next slide, please. So obviously what we're looking at here is a diagram of the heart, picture of the heart. And what I wanted to talk about here is we mentioned that the blood pressure goes up, and the way that that happens is that our blood vessels constrict. I mean, very often, I don't know about you, but I can certainly feel my heartbeat when I'm very stressed. Little bit of a heartbeat happening before when I had to go to the door in the middle of this. And this vasoconstriction, constricting of the arteries, is thought to be part of the reason why stress can be so bad for our health. And what I wanted to point out here is that there's some very interesting research that shows that our attitude towards stress is absolutely critical when it comes to how bad stress is for our well-being. So there's a TED talk called Making Stress Your Friend by someone called Kelly McGonigal, and we'll include that in the resources. I really recommend you check it out. But the crux of it is, yes, stress, if left unchecked, can be very bad for our health, but it is also an adaptive and normal process. And whether or not we see it as bad for us, and whether we're actually doing something about it or not, makes a really big difference to how much our blood vessels constrict, and therefore the incidence of mortality, in fact, is seen to reduce enormously depending on our attitude to stress. So it's a really important piece of research to be aware of. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So what works? Like I said, some of this is really not rocket science. Excuse me. One of the most powerful things that you can do for stress is exercise. And the reasons for that is that exercise releases other neurotransmitters that are really good for stress. Excuse me. And the other thing is that exercise is excellent for sleep. So these relationships are complex. Obviously, this is just a snippet of information that I'm providing in this little window. We go into a lot more detail. Obviously, I could do a whole hour on any one of these topics. But the importance of exercise is paramount, ideally daily, if not a number of times a week. And sleep. We live in a culture that doesn't value sleep and that doesn't prioritise sleep. We should be getting between 7 and 9 hours a night, and what that is will vary depending on the person. And the research is extremely clear that if you get less than that, it dramatically impacts your well-being and your performance, your functioning. So I'll just talk about a couple of the key principles in relation to getting good sleep, because some people say to me, well, it's all very well, but what do you do if you can't sleep? So probably in lieu of me being able to go into too much detail, do go to the Sleep Health Foundation website. They have fact sheets on absolutely everything and really good information on getting back to sleep. But regularity is king. So going to bed at the same time and getting up at the same time is absolutely key. So that doesn't mean that it has to be, 7 days a week, week in, week out. But as a general rule, if you can keep that regularity, that's key. Now, breathing exercises, because I mentioned before, we breathe shallow and quickly when we're stressed. When we breathe slow and long and relaxed, it kicks in the relaxation response, and you cannot be stressed and relaxed at the same time. Okay. Again, this is very brief. We will do a little breathing exercise, which is actually also a mindfulness exercise. Not all breathing exercises are, but there's an overlap, obviously. We'll talk more about mindfulness and other practices that increase our ability to be present at the end of this slide. But I also wanted to mention the incredible power of being in nature. And of course, so relevant right now, the importance of human connection for reducing stress. So for those of us that are really isolated, just really being very aware of what you can do to minimize how isolated you feel and putting that in place at this time is critically important. Hobbies are something that, is sort of, not many people have hobbies these days because we're all so busy, but they're incredibly good for stress because they require us to have a mindful attention. So we're paying attention, but not in the same way that we do at work where we're kind of boring a hole in our computer, right? So trying to get intentional about having time to be able to do your hobbies is something that's incredibly valuable as well. And ironically, again, in this time, mindfully using technology. Now, we all need to use it way more right now, but we can still be mindful of just how much we're consuming in terms of information, and particularly bad news. But yeah, just being very aware of our use of technology is also very important. Okay, and what I'm going to get you to do now is I hope that you've all got a pen and paper handy. I'll give you a second to get one or reach for it. And I want you to write down some headings because I want you to have the opportunity to reflect on what you can do to be less stressed. So you can leave as much or as little room between the headings as you think you might need. But the first heading is just simply why. I want you to think about and come up with why you're here today, why you want to learn about stress management, what's at stake if you don't, because it will be different for everybody. So why do I want to be less stressed? Why do I want to have a more resilient mind? Okay. And then next heading, I want you to write down, I am going. And if you choose to, you might like to write 1 or 2 or 3 things under that heading. The next heading I want you to write down is, I think I'm unstable.
Can you just repeat that for us again, Susie, if that's all right? We've got the first thing, which is why, but can you just kindly repeat the second for us, the second request?
The second one is, I am going to. So I am going to, it's an opportunity for you to write down 1 or 2 or 3 things, how many things you would like to commit to, being realistic, not necessarily, we want to have goals and we want to push ourselves, but we don't want to set the bar so high that we're not going to achieve them either. The next heading is support. So what will support you to reach those goals or do those things? And the next heading is challenges. What might derail your best laid plans? Obviously, routine is really helpful for developing habits, and we've all had our routines completely thrown out the window. So maybe that is something that's just about getting back to what your routines were in terms of exercise before this started. What might derail those things? And the last one is overcoming them. Okay, so what might help you overcome the challenges that you've listed there? Now, you don't have to do all of that. You don't have to do any of it. At least try, and I think it'd be great to do the first one and the second one. But if you really want to tease out how to be less stressed and what's going to help you do that, what's going to hinder you from doing that, then spend some time on that. I will give you some time during this presentation, once we've talked a little bit more about mindfulness, to do the first two questions. Okay. Next slide, please, Kat. All right, so as I said, mindfulness is a little misunderstood sometimes. So we'll get back to basics and just give you the definition that is most commonly used. So mindfulness is the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So we can all pretty much pay attention on purpose in the present moment for a moment. It's quite hard to do for any length of time. But the non-judgmentally part is very challenging for most, if not all of us. But it is a practice. It is something that we get better at the more we try. And stress is so tied up with our judgments of what's going on, whether they're good or bad. So the better that we can get at being less judgmental and more accepting of whatever it is that we can't control, the less stress we're going to experience. So in a moment, we'll do a practice counting our breaths. But I just wanted to give you an alternative definition, which is one that I learned when I was teaching mindfulness to kids, but I think it's really useful for all of us. So mindfulness is simply awareness of what's going on inside and around you, and how you feel about these things. And then on top of that, bringing an attitude of acceptance or even kindness to whatever it is you're experiencing. Okay. So as I said, the key to controlling, or being aware of what you can control and what you can't, and then bringing that compassion to your experience, okay? And what this enables us to do over time is not to react, but to respond to situations, okay? So mindfulness is also a really simple way to describe it, is that it's overriding autopilot. Most of the time, we are simply not aware of what's going on inside and around us. In fact, the research shows that 47% of the time, our mind has wandered to somewhere else apart from what's happening in that moment for us. Some more research that you can look at after this presentation. It's another TED Talk, and this fellow did a research project where he got people to track their happiness and ask them questions by pinging them, like 15,000 people, a lot of people in many countries, all different socioeconomic status, etc. And 47% of the time, we're not present. And funnily enough, we're much happier when we're present. So check that one out as well. I also just want to mention here that we have mindfulness that is a formal practice, such as meditation. And we also have mindfulness that we can apply to whatever we're doing, like having a mindful bike ride or a mindful shower, where we just really focused on sensation. When we focus on sensation, and I don't just mean touch, but sight, sound, smell, and awareness of our body, it settles the part of the brain that is active when we're stressed, okay? And what we're going to do now is a simple practice counting our breaths. And what I want you to do is simply sit up straight but relaxed. And we're going to breathe in and count one breath and out. So in and out is one breath. Breathing in and out 2 breaths. We're going to count up to 5 breaths in and out, and then back down to 1, and then back up to 5, and then down to 1. Okay, we won't do it for too long. It's a mindfulness practice. It's also a breathing exercise. And yeah, if you want to close your eyes, fine, but you don't have to. So I'll start by just guiding you. So breathing in, count 1, breathing out. Breathing in, count 2, breathing out. Just keep going in your own time. Notice whatever there is to notice. Okay. All right, so I wouldn't be surprised if many of you noticed that your mind wandered away from counting. Even though it's such a simple thing to do, count your breaths up to 5 and back down, many people lose their count. It really demonstrates for many, not everybody, some people are naturally more mindful than others, that our mind does tend to jump around, and that it's quite difficult to stay focused on one thing. So when we're practicing a formal mindfulness practice, what we're doing is we're simply noticing when our mind has strayed away from whatever it is we're focusing on, and we notice and we bring it back, and we bring it back, and we bring it back. And there's no, it's not about whether you're effective at it or not, because it's actually the process of bringing it back strengthens a part of the brain called the cingulate cortex, which is essential for emotional stability. Okay. So I've said quite a lot about that. It's a lot. So I'll just go to the next slide, please, Kat. So this website, brainfacts.org, is great because it shows you different parts of the brain and what they do. So the neuroscience is fascinating, and the reason why we're beginning to understand so much more about why mindfulness is so powerful is because of something called the functional MRI. And so an MRI is a scan of anywhere in the body, but in this case, the brain. And what it means by, when they refer to a functional MRI, they're looking at different parts of the brain that are active while you're doing certain things. Okay. Next slide, please, Kat. So the amygdala, I already mentioned, is the part of the brain that is very active when we experience stress. And most of us are experiencing more stress than ideal, which means our amygdala is more active than ideal. And when that happens, stress begets stress. It's like muscles that we use more get bigger. So our amygdala actually gets bigger. So when we practice a lot of mindfulness, the amygdala actually gets smaller, okay? We are developing new and strengthening existing neural pathways that enable us to be present more. And we are actually changing the structure of our brain with our mind, which I don't know about you, but I think is pretty cool. Okay. So basically paying attention to the present moment settles the amygdala, and what this does, next slide please, Kat, is this makes the prefrontal cortex work better. Now it makes the whole brain work better, but the prefrontal cortex is where we do a lot of decision making and complex functions, including socially mindful decisions, as it says on this slide. So in terms of our brain working better, as soon as we settle the amygdala by bringing our awareness to our body, then the prefrontal cortex will work more effectively. Okay. And as little as 10 minutes a day for 8 weeks has been shown to lead to changes in the brain consistent with less stress. Okay. And next slide, please, Kat. So just this little infographic here from a neuroscience journal, an article in a neuroscience journal from 2015. So obviously leadership roles particularly, involve lots of complex problems and people, and all architects are dealing with multiple projects and time resources and all those decisions we need to make. And the way that mindfulness meditation can help is it can improve your ability to maintain your attention, to regulate your emotions, and improves your own self-awareness. And all of this makes you better able to regulate what's going on for you. Okay. As I said, what we're doing really is bringing everything to our consciousness. And when we do that, then we are much more able to respond instead of react. So there's this physiological side of it that's going on that settles the stress response. But there's also more awareness in terms of just self-awareness and who we are, and what, these subconscious things that are running the show that we're not aware of can come into our awareness, which is very powerful. Okay. All right, so I'm actually going to get you to go back, Kat, to the slide that starts, the heading is what works. I think it is. That's it. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to spend a moment. Oh, I think we're just over time. It's good timing. Michael, do you want to get people to spend a moment now thinking about this? I've got one last slide that just touches on some things that practices can do, not just as individuals, or how would you like to proceed?
You take your time, Susie. We've got plenty of questions to go through at the end. This has been a discussion which has prompted a lot of Q&A, so I'll go through those with you shortly. But yeah, take your time.
All right, so yeah, I just wanted to give people an opportunity to go back to this list of what works, and even, just fill out question or heading 2 on that sheet of paper if you want to, basically. You might have already had an opportunity to do that. So considering there are a lot of questions, perhaps, Kat, let's go to the last slide, or it's the second last slide actually. So I did want to mention the Architect's Mental Wellbeing Toolkit, which has been produced by an organisation that called the Architect's Mental Wellbeing, sorry, not an organisation, a group of practices called the Architect's Mental Wellbeing Forum. I was going to whiz over that document actually. What I really like about it is it breaks things down into what the practice can do and what the individual can do under many headings, including things like culture and overtime and lots of very topical areas. Obviously, at a practice level, you can offer more opportunities to learn about stress management or mindfulness, or provide yoga, for example, but also opportunities for exercise and other wellbeing activities as well. Mental health first aid is really enabling somebody on your staff to be trained in dealing with mental health issues, because obviously, there's a line at which stress and mental health issues overlap. And I think it's important to, distinguish that I'm talking about promoting our mental resilience, but some of us, including myself, are already, have been or might be experiencing mental health problems. So don't hesitate to talk to somebody, to talk to your GP, to ring somebody at Beyond Blue, and at the very least, check out their website for resources as well. And of course, a healthy workplace culture where well-being and not workaholism is promoted is critical, and training also to reduce stigma and, openly discussing mental well-being is also really important. So that was all I wanted to share with you. I think this is one final slide, and you can get information from the website address there too. So I really hope that that's been helpful for you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Susie. A lot of questions have come through that session. So if that's okay with you, I'm just going to spend the next few minutes just asking some of the more prevalent questions that have come up. The first one, it relates to introverts and extroverts. As architects, there's an equal number in both camps. But do you see any significant, from your dealings with patients and your clients that you've seen, any major differences between introverts and extroverts?
I have never heard that is relevant, and I've read very widely on this topic. No, I don't believe that there's any research that shows that's the case, because I'm pretty certain that I would have come across it.
No worries at all. Sounds good.
But you know what? I would love to know, so I will look it up and I will get back to you.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. A couple of questions just relate to the TED Talk. Can you remind us the TED Talk that you mentioned earlier? Can you give us some information on that?
Of course. So I'll send through a list of resources to Kat.
Okay.
But I'm happy to. The first one was how to make stress your friend.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one I mentioned, I know that the research project that the fellow did was called Track Your Happiness. And it's trackyourhappiness.org, but there's a TED Talk about it, and the author of the researcher's name and the presenter of the TED Talk is Matt Killingsworth. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, so Matt Killingsworth, How to Make Stress Your Friend and Track Your Happiness. So if we Google those, we should be able to get access to those TED Talks.
Yeah, it's Matt Killingsworth with a K.
Right, okay, good stuff. One question that has come to mind, and that is because we are now working remotely, of all the architect members that we've been speaking to over the last 4 weeks since we've really bunkered down and commenced working remotely, I keep hearing the term, we have never worked so hard. We are at our desks at 8 o'clock in the morning. We don't switch off till 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. We don't take a lunch break. We're not really getting any break from working. How do you put in firm rules to make sure that you do actually take some time out to breathe?
Yeah, it's a big question, I think, in this industry and in many industries. I think that people really need to understand that you are not effective. You're not doing good work if you're not, if you're just staying in one place and working in that way. I mean, you would be far more effective in the 8 hours if you prioritize, or even 9 and a half, whatever, but you need to get up regularly, you need to move your body, and you need to do these things for your mental functioning to be optimal. So I think if you really appreciate that, and there's very clear evidence of that, then hopefully you can discipline yourself enough to do it. So.
Great stuff. Yeah. I think there's this obsession that you need to be on call 24 hours a day, because we have this guilt personality, this almost guilt complex really, which says, okay, we're at home, therefore we're not working as hard, and therefore we almost overexert ourselves to prove a point that is quite often in our minds, and it's of our own making. So that's a good answer. I will say that my colleague James has put up the links, How to Make Stress Your Friend by Kelly McGonigal, and also Want to Be Happier, Stay in the Moment with Matt Killingsworth. So those links are on the chat, so have a look at those as well. There was a question from Anand. He's been very active on the old chat today, and Anand asked a question which was in relation to stress. A number of his questions relate to this point, but this is quite a broad-ranging question. And he said, what are the root causes of stress? Now, I would think that anything can cause one stress. What's your response?
Look, it's a really interesting question. It's changing over time. There are certain life events, and there's this scale of stress that exists. But I think it's very out of date. It talks about, obviously right up there is the death of a loved one. Obviously grief is a stress response. But things like divorce and moving house. But, I think that we're living in a time where we're having kids later, and often our parents are elderly when we have young children, and both parents work, and there are these types of stress in our lives that are ongoing, a day in, day out, that don't really rate a mention in these scale. So it's very subjective. One thing for one person can be a lot less stressful for the next person as well. So, I mean, public speaking is known as one of the most stressful things that you can do as well, when there's not really any threat there. So there's no straightforward answer to that. There's many stresses and deadlines, of course, are one of them as well. But again, one person can deal with a deadline really well, and another, in fact, it makes them work better, whereas the next person doesn't. So it's very subjective.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Susie. One of the questions comes down, and this is one that's been asked a couple of times, which is in relation to immediate stress versus long-term stress. So one of the questions from someone on the Zoom call has come in, and it's talking about, at the moment there might be lots of deadlines, which means that there's lots of immediate stress. We've got a lot of things to accomplish right now. But long-term, the forecast for architects can look somewhat gloomy. So we've got issues with projects being delayed or postponed, and therefore those deadlines are going to become less and less. And so our current mindset, which is all about dealing with a lot of deadlines, might be in 3, 4, 6 months, 0 deadlines, which will cause a different type of stress. So any thoughts about immediate versus long-term stress? Do you see a difference?
There's definitely a difference. We have a big stress response in relation to a threat that presents, or a perceived threat that presents. And as I mentioned, our fight-flight response can't distinguish between a saber-toothed tiger and an email where somebody's, not happy with you. So that's sort of this immediate stress response. Whereas we have stresses that are ongoing, which I would call chronic stress. And we're not going to get sick from having intermittent short-term stress, but we definitely are going to feel the effects longer term when it comes to chronic stress. So they're one and the same thing. The physiology is the same, but the intensity is different. But like cortisol in the system over long periods, we know is very detrimental to the body, and that's what happens with chronic stress. Okay. But they're both bad if there's too much of them, and they play into each other as well.
Yep. Okay. There's a question from Sarah Levno who's come through on the chat box, and she said, look, she's addicted to multitasking. Since working remotely, she's doing everything at once. And she's aware that she gets this great rush, these endorphins of feeling productive when she's multitasking. But in reality, when she looks back at it, she's increasing her stress. And her errors are compounding as well. So is there any sort of guidance you can give to encourage Sarah and the rest of us about how to stop multitasking and focus on productivity and perfection instead of trying to be all things to all men?
Look, absolutely. I mean, when I run a one-off session, I nearly always do an exercise on multitasking, but today is so short that it got chopped. So being mindful means you're doing one thing at a time. Now, having said that, there are times where we need to do 2 things at once. But as much as possible, if we can become aware, then we're able to focus and go, okay, I'm just doing this now, and then you will do a better job at whatever it is that you're doing if you can pay full attention to that. But the problem with this stuff lies in the fact that we're not very good at maintaining that focus. And that's where meditation and other practices that help build our ability to do that are so powerful over time. So it's all very well to understand this stuff and to, it's a little bit like, learning theoretically how to ride a bike. The difficulty is in maintaining attention over periods of time. And we need to do that. We need to learn how to do that and strengthen the wiring that enables us to do that more easily if we're serious about that stuff. Yeah.
And a question from Kiara, who's also come through on the chat box. She talked about current employment rates. We see them escalating every day. We see, stories coming out of many different media channels around, the increasing queues at Centrelink and things like that, and not knowing when any of this will be over. That's one of the biggest issues that that we keep hearing is that we don't know when this will end. There is no defined point, which brings anxiety in itself. So her question to you is, how do we keep a positive mind on the future? What can we do to keep above this and not let ourselves be brought down by what we're seeing happening around us?
Well, I mentioned the mindful use of technology, and I think it's so critically important. So we are exposed to so much bad news all day, every day. I mean, this is just one thing we can do, but I follow an organisation called Future Crunch, and what they do is post all good news, but it's very, very intelligent news, and they do amazing analyses they're real, it's realistic, but very good quality journalism around and sharing good news stories. So that's one thing, and I would really recommend that you sign up to their newsletter because it's just amazing. And there is actually an incredible amount of really good stuff happening at the moment if you tune into that. So we can make a choice what we tune into, but we need to be aware first. Otherwise, we're just taking things on board without any awareness, and most of it is doom and gloom. The other thing that is incredibly powerful, and the research backs this up, is gratitude practice. So not just, thinking, oh, I'm so grateful because I've got a roof over my head, but actually being intentional and practicing gratitude. I write down, I've only done this for a few months, and I absolutely believe in it, and the research says the same thing, but I write down 3 things that I'm grateful for every morning and every evening. But you can also do that with your family at dinner time. You can talk about what you're grateful for every day, and that changes the wiring of our brain as well, and improves our ability to be resilient as well.
Talking of resilience, I mean, mindfulness and meditation is up there in terms of the 2 key tools to help us and maintain our resilience. Yeah. Is that a learned art? Because before you were asking us to breathe, I was writing my list down and I ended up putting bread and milk and a few other groceries that I needed to get. I mean, my brain doesn't switch off, and I'm sure many of our members on this call, we really struggle. You mentioned in your presentation about how we struggle switching off. Is it something that we need to learn? Because I failed at that today.
Okay, so the first thing you did there was judge it. I failed, right? There is no doing it right or wrong. You just experience whatever you're experiencing and bring non-judgment to it. So secondly, I have a really overactive mind. You absolutely get better at it. That's what you're doing it for. But the important thing is just to notice, and you notice things that you've never noticed before. You've certainly probably never noticed how hard it is to count your breaths, right? So it's absolutely a learned skill. Yeah.
True.
But you have to put in the effort. So.
Yeah, that's true. All right, well, we might leave it there. It's 10 minutes to 1. That was a really great session, Susie. Thank you. I really hope that was helpful to you all. And thank you again, Susie. That was a great presentation from both your kitchen and mine. And good to have you with us. And no doubt we look forward to having you back at some stage as well. But that's it for today. Thanks for joining us at the Lean In. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again on Thursday. Thank you.